after your effort, right, at the White House, if there's another virus and a pandemic scale occurs in next 5 years, are we ready?
We gave Health and Human Services a vision for the National Stockpile 2.0, so to speak, and walking down the path to do that. But really, I'm going to answer that question, but I gotta go backwards to go forwards. When I had an approved retirement prior to the pandemic, I was supposed to retire from the Navy after 30 going on 35 years in June of 20. I didn't retire until December. And so when I left Health and Human Services and FEMA, the task force, I gave then Secretary Azar a letter about what we did to get to where we were so people wouldn't forget the movie, and what was in front of Health and Human Services. And in that letter, I described the need for Health and Human Services to have somebody that understood supply chains, understood logistics, and understood the facets needed to manage a medical industrial base. Now, I'm not asking them, I was not asking the secretary to go to Congress and say, you need to stand up a DOD-like organization where you're managing, fighter aircraft and other weapon systems, and you're managing, you just have these huge, massive programs. I don't know what the number is. It's not thousands. It's not 1, 10, 20, 30 government officials that are versed in supply chain and manufacturing and could manage a medical industrial base. Because SNS 2.0, National Stockpile Redefined, needed to have a basis to which to draw from. So you needed a U.S. industrial base to do things like surge contracts. You needed a data system, the supply chain control tower that I built, to manage this flow. And really, that flow is a supply chain tower in the middle, understanding pandemic environment and a public health emergency. What are the hospitals, nursing homes, and people that are going to treat patients? Do they have the supplies or not? You have a need for states to have things, hospitals to have a little bit of a stockpile. A national stockpile is an absolute backup, and those echelons of supply should probably give you months worth of shock absorber, so you can kick in your surge contracts and the industrial base can have time to ramp, all with the data ecosystem needed to have the visibility across that. And so, unfortunately, we were on the road to visioning that, and I had to step away along with some other DoD members. And Health and Human Services does not really have the staff yet to go do that. And so the answer to the question is that we're better off. Look, the national stockpile, when I showed up, had 18 million N95 masks in it that had been given out. In December of 21, when the Biden administration made the decision to issue 400 million N95 masks from the stockpile, that was half the stockpile. It had about 850 million. It's not like we're completely broken, but you were yet to be linked together in the fashion that I've described, and to be able to be reliant on surge contracts and put this ecosystem. We have the semblance of the data, but we don't have all the other pieces. And so I'm not, this is non-political, this is just my view of a DoD logistician who's gonna plan for the worst and have the things in place needed for a long-term fight. And I just don't see us as a nation there yet. But I hope I answered the question, which was, did you fix it? Yes, but no.
So in February 2022, 7 cabinet agencies published reports identifying key weaknesses in some of the nation's most crucial supply chains and devising multi-year strategies to address those weaknesses. The White House also published a capstone report that provides an overview of the key actions of the administration has taken over the past year to reduce the vulnerability of U.S. supply chain across a range of key sectors. Just for the benefits of the audience, the 7 cabinet agencies are Department of Defense, Homeland Security, Commerce, Energy, Agriculture, Transportation, and Department of Health and Human Services. So it's a quite comprehensive report and an assessment. So John, in your opinion, what are the emerging perspectives and the collective efforts from the US government about building Americans' long-term resilience across critical supply chains?
And boy, that's a really complicated question, and I know I'm not going to do it absolute justice, but there are a lot of things in motion, a lot of things. I can start with current administration. The Biden team is working something that I personally find like, wow, if this works, this is going to be fabulous. The project is called Flow, but Flow is really at its heart understanding freight across America, and to unstick the sticky pieces of it to get supplies moving to consumers in the United States. And I've talked to various officials that are working on that task because they were very interested in the supply chain control tower that I built at Health and Human Services, that I believe is that there's one piece of the work that is I think is certainly going to be enduring, because I know in the supply chain reports, the Health and Human Services and the White House highlighted that as an enduring feature. And that effort, Flow, is really about how do you ingest, or how do you take in commercial information and safeguard it, aggregate it, so nobody gets hurt, but then you can use it to make decisions. And you can imagine if I was Landstar trucking firm, I may or may not want to tell you how optimized my fleet is or not, right? Or if I'm Norfolk Southern, I might not want to tell you my sticking points for my railroad, right? And so how does the federal government, let me put it this way, the Department of Transportation does not have a freight czar. I think they're trying to create one, because they have an airplane person, a road person, a maritime person, right? They're kind of like this. Who manages freight across America, right? So you just think about that. In fact, how do we optimize freight across America? I hope they can work that project and get to an outcome that they can really see where issues are, reapply resources to unstick things. That would be fabulous. And it's a data effort. If anything that is a data effort. Congress is, both House and Senate, is working on 2 pieces of legislation that get after a lot of things. One's called the America Competes Act. One's called the United States Innovation and Competition Act. They both focus on chips. Why don't we make chips in America? Right, and could unlock a lot of supply chain problems. But then there's a lot more in those, and there's money for resources for about medical supplies. There's like $1 billion something, and I forget which act, for public wireless supply chains. Certainly an infrastructure problem for some of this. There's Buy American, there's robotics, advanced manufacturing, the National Science Foundation, potentially $45 billion. We'll see what Congress actually appropriates for doing activities essentially that sound like onshore and or moving facilities to places that might, as you alluded to in the beginning, might not have anything to do with China or Russia or other folks, right? And if I took those 7 reports, DoD, Homeland Security, et cetera, and save people from reading them, I think that there's several themes across them. They all talk about dollar investment needed. They talk about a trained workforce. I can tell you in DoD, just from my shipbuilding understandings and days, welders. We talk more about welders, right? I mean, so whatever the workforce is, trained. And I will tell you there's probably a digital training along in there as well. Investments in new technologies. One of my least favorite, but things we have to talk about is stockpiling. Just think of things. Something that we did in the task force was to try to, we weren't going to figure out very quickly how to onshore all the pharmaceuticals that we might need for the American public. So we went and bought a whole bunch of advanced pharmaceutical ingredients and put them in a stockpile, because God forbid we were shut off from those. So stockpiles have a place, but it's one dimension of resiliency. Resources, tax credits, partners and allies. But the single biggest thread across all of them is data, is data. And so I think the federal government is thinking through that. But I go back to one of my educational experiences in my DoD days was at the Industrial College of the Armed Forces. And really that National Defense University, and that it's now, I think that college is now called the Eisenhower School, was all about maintaining the ability for the Department of Defense to mobilize the nation. And we thought about things, and people wrote theses on how education fits into mobilization, finance, what are the mechanisms that industry and government can do. Healthcare, you need a healthy workforce, you need a well-fed workforce, things that you wouldn't normally think about. All the manufacturing experience. I think we called it telecommunications back in the day, but there's a data piece. And I can go on and on about how to mobilize a nation. And I brought some of all of that to the supply chain task force. But I think in the end, the federal government has to take a look at that ecosystem. And we're going to have to solve the data exchange to understand it. We're going to have a much more agile manufacturing, and we're in the 4th industrial revolution. And I can tell you that from my task force days, it's not about bringing a machine that was being used overseas to make a mask, bring it to the United States, put US labor on it, et cetera, and have it be competitive. Mm-hmm. We're going to have to innovate and use advanced manufacturing techniques to make it competitive. And I think it's all those investments. So I see an immense amount of activity and in the right direction, but it's not a light switch. Mm-hmm. It's going to be a rheostat. And the one thing that I don't see that would make me feel a lot better is the one person being put in charge. We produced 7 different reports. Congress is undecided on, is it Department of Commerce, Department of Homeland Security? Who is responsible for the U.S. industrial base?
Yeah, that's absolutely a critical point. I just wanted to share FLOW stands for Freight Logistic Optimization Works, right? FLOW.
Thank you. I was having a senior moment.
Yeah, I also wanted to add, I have to admit, there's so many reports out there. I haven't read all of them, right? But I took away a few industries I think being identified critical for future supply chain from those reports. Just to name a few: semiconductor industry, battery, information and communication technologies, rare earth elements and materials, the PPE, healthcare, pharmaceutical ingredients, and vaccines. So those are the ones seems to be on top of the list from industry standpoints. So John, as a tradition of our program, I hope to build an intellectual bridge between the current and future generations. Einstein said any intellectual fool can make things bigger and more complex. It takes a touch of genius and a lot of courage to move in the opposite direction. So John, would you like to paint a picture of supply chain resilience by giving a new perspective?
Sure. I'm going to keep it simple. And unfortunately, I have such a long defense background. The Marine Corps has a motto of Semper Fidelis, always ready. And occasionally people morph that to Semper Gumby, always flexible. And when I think about supply chains, and I think about what I walked through in the beginning of the pandemic, it was not always faithful and it was not always flexible. It had a lot of weak links in it. We must take advantage of the fourth industrial revolution and get to Semper Gumby, having the ability to be agile and flexible to withstand any change and any shock and any dynamic, and overcome, adapt and overcome. I think if you can think about it in that manner, I think you're very well off, and it's not a very complex thought, but that's where my brain gravitates to.
Yeah, that absolutely captured the essence of resilience. I also have an idea to exchange with you. So imagine a resilient supply chain system as an intelligent ride-sharing network. Firstly, a reliable digital platform provides real-time data exchanges between supply. You can think of passengers and demand, aka available cars and drivers, as well as trading conditions, such as traffic condition. Secondly, the system manages obstacles and recoveries from car accidents, traffic jams, and road blockage through optimization and adjustment in order to minimize disruptions. Lastly, the system makes predictions based on historical data and real-time visibility to look for machine learning patterns and drive continuous improvements. In other words, just like the ride-sharing system, an innovative and resilient supply chain networks is built on trust, visibility, agility, predictability, and adaptability. So John, we really appreciate your leadership in building a resilient supply chain and your partnership in exploring different perspectives on this imperative topic. What is the final thoughts or one thing you'd like the audience to remember?
Well, picking one thing, let me pick two things. So
okay.
if you ever get a chance to step into and lead in a crisis, pick something big, bold, and go after it. Right, that's one thing. But here on the supply chains, I really do think the end-to-end visibility and the data infrastructure across the supply chain is probably the key. I think it was key to building a response, and I think it's going to be key as you go forward. And if I can put my EY hat on for a moment, when people we help people stress test their supply chains, etc. 5 things come out of it, and one of those is end-to-end visibility. I'd end with that. If they take nothing more away, that they realize that end-to-end visibility has a piece in supply chain resiliency.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. I want our audience to remember that a supply chain network, as you said, John, is as strong as the weakest link. So our job is to identify the weakness and strengthen the system. In addition to technological advancement and the supply chain strategy, the risk mitigation plan always depends on the resilience of your supply chain partners, and your relationships with them makes the difference. And I like to quickly share the poll result that we have this 2 questions. So the first one is the U.S. supply chain system strengths and weakness, right? And what's the weakest link of the US supply chain system, and it's a single choice. We have majority of our audience, 55%, answered upstream, which are, the raw materials, for example, electronic components and rare earth mineral, things like that. And then, interestingly, the second highest vote was logistics, either from air, ocean, or land. That was 24%. And then we have 10% on the midstream as well as the downstream. So that's the weakness. And in terms of the strengths, which is a multiple choice, we have almost 60% of audience answer R&D, followed by logistics, 38%, and then production and manufacturing, 21%, and 10% for services. So John, what are you thinking about those answers from the audience?
I tend to agree that we have a significant, I think, some degree advantage in what you termed as upstream raw materials, et cetera. I tend to do a lot of some of that here, send it away, then it come back, right? And so there's a lot of that. I do think that we do have a lot of technology, et cetera, part of the value chain. I think the audience, captured pretty eloquently the strengths and weaknesses. I don't see something that I would go, oh no, that's not.
Great. Thank you, John. I hope you enjoyed our chat. And I hope our conversation leads to many more discussions about supply chain resilience in the corporate boardroom, supplier meetings, as well as possibly at the dinner table and beyond.